So today I just want to introduce Chantal Mouffe, and I'm going to be covering her book, The Return of the Political, which was written in 1993. So it's not one of her latest books, but it's a foundational book, and I wanted to start there first. So the first thing I want to do is say kudos to the name. I love the name, Chantal Mouffe. I mean, you can't get any better than that as far as just like an interesting name. So let me tell you a little bit about who she is. She is a political theorist. She says she prefers that term to political scientist, even though she is in a political science department, because a political theorist is about dealing with ideas, concepts, and also real world reactions, and not primarily statistics and numbers. Her history is really interesting. She married Ernesto Laclau, an Argentinian political theorist, in 1975. Laclau passed away in 2014, but they were partners for years, and it was the co-authorship of the book Hegemony and Socialist Strategy with Laclau that kind of got her career started. And the content of that book, I haven't read it, but I've read about it. It sounds like it kind of shaped a lot of her future thought. Now she is at the University of Westminster as probably a professor emeritus. Very, very active still, and has followed a trajectory that I think is very admirable, where she has built on solid ideas all the way through her career until they have kind of matured at this point, and we can, I'm sure, see the trajectory from this book that I'm going to cover all the way through until the latest book. So these are some of the books that she's written. The one that I'm going to cover, also The Democratic Paradox from 2000, On the Political, 2005, Agonistics, and we'll talk about what that means, Thinking the World Politically in 2013, and In the Name of the People from 2016. She is an advocate of a certain type of left populism, and so that last book that I mentioned, In the Name of the People, was written specifically to encourage and shape the Podemos movement in Spain. This was a movement that became a political party. It was initiated in 2014 against austerity measures that were really exposing class inequality in Spain. And it has become, Podemos has become the fourth largest party in Spain with almost 13% of the Spanish Congress of Deputies. So Chantal Mouffe is one of those thinkers who has spanned the great divide between theory and practice, and has not scrupled to get involved in political movements that she feels are worth supporting and reflect her views. So her latest book, and I definitely want to read this probably next, is For a Left Populism. And that came out, I want to say 2018. Okay, so one of the things I did to try to figure out a little bit about who Chantal Mouffe was before I got started with this book is to read the chapter McKenzie Wark wrote about her in General Intellects. And by the way, I would recommend this book, General Intellects, to anyone who wants to get kind of an overview of some of the most important thinkers in the 20th and 21st centuries. One of the things that McKenzie Wark does at the beginning of the chapter that she writes on Chantal Mouffe is to talk about the distinction between liberal democracy and democracy. And of course, she's doing that because this is a distinction that Chantal Mouffe makes. Hillary Clinton and, say, Jeb Bush or George Bush or any Bush would fit into the liberal camp, whereas she says Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are both, quote, democratic. So we've been trained to think of liberal democracy as the two naturally go together, but Chantal Mouffe does not think they always or necessarily go together, and that, as a matter of fact, liberalism in many ways erodes and corrupts the base, the foundation of democracy. So democracy is about what the people want. Um, and what the people want may have to do with their identity, may have to do with something that they hold in common somehow. And liberal thinking, Enlightenment, rational, liberal thinking, tends to go against this idea of particular popular wants and needs, and actually kind of endorses the idea that those who know more ought to devise the system and how it is run. And so what has happened over the long haul is that liberalism has encouraged a sort of managerial, rational, rule of the expert type of politics, in which, as Wark points out, the left and the right end of the spectrum have converged towards the middle and towards this ideal of apolitical rulership or management, right? And so what we see in the rise of leaders like Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, or in Podemos and Syriza in Greece and movements like that, is an attempt on the part of people to assert what they want out of the political system and to reject the managerial overlords, I guess you might say. So here's Wark. She says both Sanders and Trump emphasize a rather stronger sense of what it means to be included as a citizen in the demos, the people, and a corresponding sense of exclusion. For Sanders, what is excluded is Wall Street. For Trump, what is excluded is the foreigner. And this raises the specter of the democratic again. Okay, for Mouffe, the democratic comes about inevitably as an us and them phenomenon. And the question for Mouffe, as somebody who tends to lean to the left, is what do we do with that inevitability that really will always exist? You can't stamp out the human tendency to form us versus them. What do you do with that so that it is controlled and channeled in a way that is actually beneficial, where people can compete and can debate and can fight each other without destroying each other? That, for Mouffe, is democracy. So Mouffe talks about, and this is also covered by Wark, stressors that are pulling liberal democracy apart. In the very first part of Mouffe's book, The Return of the Political, she talks about how there are these stressors on liberal democratic politics that are starting to make it fray at the edges. One of them I've mentioned already, austerity economics, which has put such a strain on working class people as they try to make a living, where in a country where taxes are lowered for the businesses that they work for, where there's a smaller and smaller social safety net, where more and more of the nation's income or tax income is going towards paying off debt and so on. Okay. Another stressor is the refugee crisis, the immigration crisis in a lot of countries, right? That goes along with that, and also is exacerbated by climate change, because the climate change is forcing more migration as people are finding it harder to make a living or eke out a living, especially on the land in their own countries. And so these two things go together, because when austerity economics hits working class people hard, they look to the refugee crisis as kind of like an explanation for why it is that they are experiencing economic stress. refugees become and immigrants become the problem, or the source of the problem, and the an element in the solution of basically expelling, or circling the wagons. Um, so as these stressors push upon the liberal democratic system, the liberal part begins to fray. The liberal part is this idea, like we're all individuals, we all have natural rights, we're all equal as individuals, and so on. And we're all economic actors, and there's no, race, class, gender, doesn't matter. We all see green, that kind of thinking, okay? That gets frayed as people of various groups and classes feel the burn of these stressors. And it exposes, according to Mouffe, this ineradicable, essentially political nature of human beings, that there never will really be a time in which we are all, individual rational actors, all absolutely equal, all motivated by the same, same desires and interests. This was the case all along, according to Mouffe, but now we see it because it has been laid bare by the fact that some groups are being pushed up against the wall and having to assert themselves however they can, through political movements, through protests, and so on. Francis Fukuyama wrote his famous book, The End of History and the Last Man, that claimed that with the collapse of communism, we would see the triumph of liberal democracy and capitalism around the world. And that if there were, minor, like, nationalist upcroppings of more or less, resistance against the global economy, against democracy, against secularization and all of that, globalization, it would just be minor road bump. But the overwhelming forces of economic rationality and the desirability of liberal democracy with its, supposed guarantee of our natural rights and freedoms would prevail. And so we were looking at the, quote, end of history. And so Mouffe looks at the same thing and sees that in the wake of the collapse of communism, you get all of these, like former Eastern Bloc countries that come back to life, and they reassert their ethnic identity, and within them there are multiple ethnic and religious identities. And she is not at all convinced that we are looking at the end of history in 1993. Rather, what she sees, and this is kind of cool, right? Because later on it became way more obvious, but in 1993, she's very, very certain that we are not going to have an end of history, but history is starting up all over again. And so what she sees is an explosion of particularisms, and again, a reassertion of the inevitability of politics. So this book, and I think a lot of Mouffe's career, has been about trying to reconcile people on the left with the inevitability and even the desirability of democratic politics, or at least politics, hopefully democratic. All right, so next I will get into more into the introduction. I'll also at least cover the first chapter of this book. We'll get into Mouffe's reasoning in greater detail. All right, but I think this is very promising. She seems to be thinking along the same lines that I am. So I'm hoping to get a lot out of learning more about Chantal Mouffe. All right, see you next week. Bye.